Tell me, where do you usually watch my videos? At home, work, or somewhere else?
You know how life has a way of slamming the door on everything you thought was solid, leaving you standing there in the rain with nothing but echoes of betrayal ringing in your ears. And in my case, that brutal unraveling started the day my husband of 22 years, Mark Thompson, the ambitious real estate attorney from the bustling suburbs of Cleveland, decided that our shared life, complete with two grown children and a cozy colonial home filled with memories of family barbecues and holiday gatherings, was no longer convenient for his upward trajectory, especially after his firm landed those lucrative corporate clients who demanded he cut ties with anything resembling emotional baggage, like a devoted wife who had paused her nursing career to support his rise. I remember sitting across from him in that sterile conference room downtown, surrounded by his team of lawyers who looked like they stepped out of a bad television drama, their pens scratching away at documents that systematically dismantled our joint savings, the vacation cabin in the Smoky Mountains that we had bought during a rare moment of marital bliss, and even the modest retirement fund I had scrimped together from part-time shifts at the local clinic. All while Mark avoided my gaze, claiming that the prenup we signed in our 20s, back when love blinded us to fine print, gave him the upper hand because I had supposedly wasted opportunities by choosing family over ambition, a narrative his attorneys spun with such precision that the judge, a stern woman in her 60s who probably saw this script 100 times, nodded along without a flicker of sympathy for the woman left penniless at 48, staring at a future that resembled the empty half of our once shared king-size bed. It felt like the ground had vanished beneath me, especially when our daughter Emily, fresh out of college and already interning at his office, texted me that she understood his side because Dad works so hard, and our son Jake, the quiet one who loved tinkering with cars in the garage, simply stopped returning my calls, leaving me to wonder if the family I poured my heart into had been an illusion all along. Sustained by my optimism and his calculated charm that masked affairs with paralegals and clients' wives whispered about at neighborhood block parties. Desperate for any anchor in the storm, I loaded my reliable but dented Ford Explorer with whatever clothes and keepsakes hadn't been auctioned off to pay his legal fees, and drove westward through the flat farmlands of Ohio. The radio tuned to classic country stations crooning about lost love and second chances that now seemed like cruel jokes, until I reached the weathered farmhouse in rural Medina County where my mother, Eleanor Hayes, had lived out her final years after Dad passed from a heart attack in the 90s, a place I inherited but avoided because walking its creaky floors without her warm voice calling from the kitchen evoked too sharp a pain, reminding me of summers spent weeding the vegetable garden or winters huddled by the wood stove sharing stories of her own youthful heartbreaks in post-war America. Mom had always been my rock, the widow who turned a small inheritance into a modest real estate side hustle by flipping fixer-uppers in the 70s when women entrepreneurs were still fighting for respect, and though she never boasted about it, her eyes would light up with a knowing glint when she advised me to keep a few aces up your sleeve, Sarah, because men like your father, and maybe yours, will always play their hand first. Words I dismissed as old-fashioned wisdom until now, when starting over meant confronting the dust-covered relics of her life in a house that smelled of aged wood and faint lavender from her favorite soap. I threw myself into the renovation with a fervor born of necessity, scrubbing the yellowed walls of the kitchen where she once prepared those legendary pot roasts for church suppers, my muscles aching from the effort, but my mind clearing slightly with each swipe of the sponge, imagining how I might transform this relic into a rental property or even an Airbnb to scrape together enough for a fresh start. Perhaps relocating to a quiet town like Asheville where artists and divorcees rebuilt lives amid the mountains. On the third day, as sunlight filtered through the lace curtains casting patterns like forgotten dreams on the peeling floral wallpaper, my knuckles grazed an irregularity beneath the plaster while attacking a particularly stubborn stain, and when I pressed harder, a hollow resonance echoed back, not the dull thud of solid wall but a metallic undertone that sent a shiver through me, hinting at something concealed that no ordinary farmhouse would hide unless it carried the weight of untold stories. Curiosity overriding caution, I fetched a sturdy butter knife from the mismatched silverware drawer and carefully pried at the edges until a concealed panel gave way with a soft groan, revealing a compact wall safe embedded in the framework, its dial tarnished but functional, evoking images of spy novels I devoured in my youth where such devices guarded fortunes or scandals from prying eyes. My hands trembled as I tested combinations, starting with family dates. My own birthday first, June 15th, 1977, the year Mom called her miracle child, after years of hoping and, to my astonishment, the tumblers aligned with a satisfying click, the door swinging open to expose a velvet-lined interior cradling a single envelope, its paper aged to a creamy yellow and sealed with a blob of red wax bearing her initial E, addressed in her elegant cursive to my dearest Sarah. For when you need it most. Collapsing onto the worn linoleum floor amid soapy puddles, I slit the seal with the same knife and unfolded the pages, my vision blurring with a rush of tears as I absorbed her words, penned perhaps in her last lucid months before the cancer sapped her strength. If this finds you, life has dealt you a cruel blow, the kind that tests the steel in your spine, and know that I've left you this secret, my ultimate trump card, untouched by time or thieves, a weapon forged from truths no lawyer's tongue can twist, designed to make the guilty pay without costing your soul, but wield it with care, for secrets like this illuminate shadows you might wish stayed dark. The implications swirled in my mind like a gathering storm. What hidden power could she have safeguarded that promised retribution against the man who had eviscerated my world? And in that charged moment, fueled by a spark of defiant anger, I recalled overhearing from a mutual acquaintance about Mark's indiscretions at a recent legal conference, so I composed an anonymous email to the Cleveland gossip column in a local paper, detailing just enough salacious details about his pattern of philandering with junior associates to spark interest. Without implicating myself directly, hitting send with a mix of trepidation and thrill. By nightfall, as I sat under the dim kitchen light nursing a mug of instant tea, my phone lit up with alerts to the breaking story, Mark's polished image tarnished in pixelated print with headlines questioning his professional ethics. And I allowed myself a quiet chuckle, the first genuine one in months, raising my mug in a solitary toast to this modest victory that pricked his ego without drawing his fire back to me. Yet, as the letter's words echoed in the silence, a deeper unease settled in. Wondering if her trump card held the key to total reclamation or merely opened a Pandora's box of complications that could ensnare me further in the web I was desperate to escape. As the first hints of dawn crept through the farmhouse windows like hesitant intruders, painting the cluttered kitchen in soft grays that did little to dispel the shadows of doubt lingering from the night's revelations, I found myself unable to retreat to the sagging bed upstairs, so instead I refilled my mug with the dregs of that bitter instant tea and returned to the oak table where the letter lay open like an unfinished confession, its pages whispering promises of empowerment amid the ruins of my appended life, compelling me to reread every meticulously inked line as if Eleanor's spirit might emerge from the paper to guide my next unsteady step in this unexpected inheritance of intrigue and potential vindication. Her narrative unfolded with the clarity of someone who had anticipated my desperation, detailing how in the late 70s, during an era when single mothers like her navigated a man's world of real estate transactions with little more than grit and a ledger book, she had uncovered irregularities in a cluster of family-owned parcels near Lake Erie, undervalued farmlands that developers eyed hungrily, but which she shrewdly leveraged through off-the-record partnerships to secure modest gains for our future. Stashing away notarized affidavits, ledgers of under-the-table payments, and even grainy cassette recordings of negotiations where crooked agents admitted to inflating assessments to skim profits, all preserved as her trump card against those who might one day prey on her legacy, particularly warning that men in pinstripe suits from big city firms often masqueraded as allies while plotting to erode women's hard-won stability through endless legal maneuvers that favored the bold and the bankrolled. The weight of it settled over me like a heavy quilt on a sweltering night, because Mark's career had been built precisely on such predatory practices, his firm notorious among Cleveland's inner circles for swooping in on distressed properties during economic dips like the 2008 crash, foreclosing on families who reminded me too much of my own current straits, and suddenly fragments of our marriage replayed in my mind with sharper edges, his casual dismissals of Mom's quaint little deals during family dinners, the way he handled her estate paperwork after her passing with an efficiency that now struck me as suspiciously thorough, as if he had long known the vulnerabilities hidden in her portfolio and positioned himself to exploit them during our divorce proceedings, turning what should have been my safety net into another asset he could claim under the guise of marital dissolution. I paced the length of the porch as the sun climbed higher, the wooden boards groaning underfoot in sympathy with my churning thoughts, torn between the allure of wielding this arsenal to claw back some financial dignity, perhaps enough to cover a down payment on a modest condo in a place like Columbus where I could restart my nursing credentials without the ghost of our shared history haunting every corner, and the gnawing fear that unleashing it would invite a backlash from his network of influential contacts, dragging me into depositions and countersuits that could leave me more isolated than before, a cautionary tale whispered among the PDA moms and bowling league buddies who once envied our picture-perfect facade. That internal tug-of-war intensified when a knock echoed from the front door around noon, pulling me from my reverie to find Mrs. Hargrove, the spry 82-year-old widow from the neighboring plot who had tended the same flower beds since Eisenhower was president, standing there with a wicker basket brimming with heirloom tomatoes, still warm from the vine, and a conspiratorial smile that suggested she sensed the undercurrents of change in the air around Eleanor's old place. Over slices of her homemade bread slathered with fresh butter in the sun-dappled living room, she reminisced about Mom's reputation as the neighborhood's unofficial dealmaker, the woman who outfoxed land speculators in the 80s by quietly buying back foreclosed acres through proxies and reselling them at a premium to young families seeking the American dream of rural stability, dropping a pointed clue about how Eleanor once bested a slick lawyer from the city in a boundary dispute over wetland rights, her eyes narrowing as she added that such victories came from sharp dealings kept under wraps, the kind that make powerful folks sweat when the truth bubbles up years later, words that landed like puzzle pieces snapping into place, confirming my suspicions that Mom's trump card targeted precisely the breed of opportunist Mark embodied. Emboldened yet uneasy by this validation, I spent the afternoon delving deeper into the safe's contents, emerging with a dog-eared folder of correspondence that outlined a tangled web of transactions linking her properties to shell companies suspiciously similar to those Mark's firm represented, each revelation stoking a fire of righteous indignation tempered by humorous reflections on how I had once teased Mom for her paranoid filing system during visits, little knowing it was a fortress against the very betrayals now afflicting me. By evening, with the sky streaking orange like a warning flare, that simmering resentment prompted a calculated bit of mischief to test the waters of retaliation without fully committing to the big guns. I recalled a hilarious anecdote from last year's firm retreat where Mark, in a tipsy attempt to impress clients, flipped his golf cart into a sand trap during a corporate outing. Photos of his disheveled escape circulating briefly among close friends before he quashed them, so using a disposable email service from my laptop on the porch swing, I crafted a spoofed message purporting to come from his office's internal server, attaching those salvaged snapshots with a fabricated subject line about Q3 performance review, lessons in humility, and blind copying his key partners and a few nosy journalists who covered legal gossip. Within hours, as I monitored the fallout from anonymous feeds on my phone while sipping chamomile tea to steady my nerves, social media buzzed with thinly veiled jabs at his unforeseen obstacles, his professional facade cracking just enough to elicit chuckles from former colleagues and a spike in his search engine alerts that I imagined drove him to distraction, providing a fleeting but delicious satisfaction in watching the man who orchestrated my downfall squirm publicly over something as trivial as bruised pride. Yet as twilight deepened and I methodically repacked the documents into the safe for safekeeping, my fingers brushed against an overlooked envelope tucked in the back, yielding a faded color photograph that froze me in place. There was Mom in her prime. Mid-40s with that signature auburn bob and a confident stance at what appeared to be a groundbreaking ceremony for a suburban development, shaking hands with a younger Mark, his arms slung casually around her shoulders in a gesture of camaraderie that belied any notion of strangers, raising a torrent of questions about the depth of their connection and how it might redefine the very foundation of the trump card she intended as my salvation. Gripping that faded photograph as if it might dissolve into smoke under too much scrutiny, I spent the better part of the morning ensconced in the farmhouse's musty attic, surrounded by cobweb-draped trunks and forgotten heirlooms that seemed to mock my growing bewilderment, poring over the image until the faces blurred from repetition, forcing me to confront the unsettling reality that Mark, the man I had pledged my life to in a sun-drenched Cleveland chapel back in 1995, had crossed paths with my mother at least a decade earlier during her heyday as a self-made real estate maven navigating the cutthroat terrain of Midwest land deals where every handshake concealed a potential double cross. The snapshot captured them at ease amid a crowd of hard-hatted workers and local dignitaries at the groundbreaking for what the faded banner proclaimed as Hayes-Thompson Commons, a modest housing development on the outskirts of Akron that I vaguely recalled Mom mentioning as one of her proudest ventures, the kind where she had pooled resources with partners to transform overgrown lots into starter homes for blue-collar families much like our own during my teenage years. But seeing Mark there, his youthful features already etched with that predatory gleam he later honed in boardrooms, arm draped possessively around her shoulders while she beamed with what now struck me as guarded optimism, ignited a cascade of suspicions that he had not merely stumbled into our family orbit, but had deliberately orbited it, perhaps courting me as a strategic foothold to access the undervalued assets Eleanor had so carefully stewarded against the encroachments of ambitious outsiders like him. This revelation twisted like a knife in the remnants of my trust, prompting me to sift through adjacent files in the safe that corroborated the timeline, yellowed contracts dated to the early 80s outlining joint ventures where Thompson and Associates, Mark's nascent firm even then, had provided legal counsel for her transactions, ostensibly to navigate zoning laws, but likely to embed clauses that allowed him to siphon equity over time. A slow bleed that culminated in our divorce when his lawyers cited those same intertwined holdings as community property ripe for his exclusive claim, leaving me to wonder how many of our marital milestones, from the birth of our children to the purchase of that ill-fated cabin, had been mere diversions in his long game of acquisition. The dilemma gnawed at me throughout the afternoon as I wandered the overgrown backyard, weeds tangling around my ankles like unanswered questions, debating whether to dismiss this as coincidental networking in Ohio's tight-knit business circles or to pursue verification that could shatter any illusion of innocence, knowing full well that chasing such threads risked pulling me deeper into a vortex of litigation where his resources would dwarf my fledgling resolve, yet the injustice of it all. Imagining him toasting his successes with champagne bought from my mother's sweat fueled a reckless determination that overrode common sense, leading me to that fateful decision to drive into the dimly lit underbelly of Cleveland after dusk. Alone in my rattling SUV with nothing but a burner phone and a printout of Lenny's napkin-scrawled number, confronting the shady ex-colleague in a greasy spoon diner where the fluorescent lights buzzed like swarming doubts and the air hung heavy with the scent of overcooked burgers and stale coffee. You might judge me harshly for venturing out unaccompanied into that seedy corner of the city, where shadows from passing semis elongated like threats and the parking lot felt like a setup for ambush. A choice born of impulsive fury rather than calculated strategy that could have easily backfired by alerting Mark's surveillance or landing me in a compromising conversation recorded for his arsenal. But in that moment of raw vulnerability, the prospect of unearthing concrete proof outweighed the peril, and as Lenny slid into the booth opposite me, his tie loosened and eyes darting like a cornered weasel, He confirmed my worst fears under the pressure of my pointed questions and a veiled threat to expose his own minor indiscretions from their law school days. With a voice lowered to a conspiratorial rasp amid the clatter of dishes, he admitted that Mark had indeed been aware of Eleanor's portfolio long before their wedding bells, having represented her in several deals that positioned him to monitor and eventually manipulate her assets through advisory roles that masked self-serving maneuvers, such as rerouting sale proceeds into trusts he controlled under the pretense of tax shelters, all of which he weaponized during the divorce to argue that her gifts to me were tainted by irregularities, thereby justifying the asset forfeiture that left me scraping by on sporadic freelance nursing gigs. Bolstered by this insider validation yet shaken by the ethical quagmire it revealed, implicating not just Mark, but potentially Mom in gray area practices that skirted legality to protect her independence. I navigated the rain-slicked highways back to the farmhouse under a canopy of stars obscured by low clouds, my mind racing with the moral bind of whether to weaponize this knowledge at the cost of tarnishing her memory or let it fester as another injustice swallowed by the system, an internal conflict that viewers like you might decry as naive stubbornness, clinging to outdated loyalties when pragmatism demanded swift action. Channeling that turmoil into a more immediate outlet for my pent-up ire, I devised a clever sabotage upon arriving home, still wired from the encounter. By crafting a fabricated digital audit trail using free online templates and anonymous proxies to mimic an official IRS inquiry into discrepancies in Mark's firm's historical filings, complete with invented red flags tied to those very 80s deals. Then, dispatching it via encrypted email to their compliance department with a forged header from a government domain that I knew would trigger protocols and paranoia. The next morning, as I monitored the ripples from my laptop over a breakfast of oatmeal that tasted like victory's first bite, industry forums and discreet contacts buzzed with reports of the firm's frantic internal scramble. Partners convening emergency meetings to dissect the phantom probe, while Mark no doubt paced his corner office like a caged bull, his meticulously curated reputation wobbling under the weight of self-inflicted panic that diverted resources from his current caseload and sowed seeds of doubt among clients wary of regulatory heat. I permitted myself a wry chuckle at the absurdity of it all, picturing his flustered calls to accountants and the ironic twist of him unraveling over shadows of his own making. A satisfying mini-triumph that reaffirmed my agency without crossing into outright illegality. Yet as the adrenaline ebbed and I returned to the safe under the afternoon's slanting light, my probing fingers dislodged a concealed ledger from its depths. Its pages crammed with ledger entries and affidavits stamped with official seals that laid bare irrefutable proof of fraud in those foundational transactions, forged endorsements, and laundered funds. But to activate this bombshell would necessitate implicating threads of complicity that wove through my own family history, binding me inextricably to the sins I sought to avenge. Barricading myself within the farmhouse's creaky confines for what felt like an eternity, but spanned only 3 restless days and nights, I immersed myself in the labyrinthine details of that unearthed ledger. Its closely spaced entries chronicling a web of financial maneuvers from the mid-80s that intertwined Eleanor's resourceful acquisitions with Mark's emerging legal machinations, revealing how he had subtly redirected funds from her revitalized properties into opaque investment vehicles that bolstered his firm's portfolio while diminishing her holdings through a series of advisory fees disguised as routine consultations, a pattern of exploitation that extended seamlessly into our marriage when he leveraged those same diminished assets to argue in court that I brought little to the table beyond homemaking duties, thereby justifying the near-total forfeiture of our shared wealth during the divorce that left me contemplating bankruptcy notices alongside recipes for budget casseroles. The moral quandary loomed larger with each page turned under the erratic glow of a single desk lamp, as activating this evidence promised not only to dismantle his professional empire, triggering investigations that could freeze accounts and revoke licenses built on decades of such sleights of hand, but also risked exposing Eleanor's own complicit shortcuts, like backdated contracts and unreported cash exchanges that skirted regulations in an era when women like her had few avenues to compete. without bending rules, forcing me to grapple with whether true justice required sacrificing her reputation as the upright matriarch who taught Sunday school and volunteered at the county fair, or if preserving her legacy meant allowing Mark's predation to stand unchallenged. A debate that raged internally as I paced the shadowed hallways, occasionally pausing to glance at her framed portrait on the mantel where her knowing smile seemed to urge boldness tempered by wisdom. That fragile equilibrium shattered on the fourth evening when a sudden downpour battered the roof like accusatory drumbeats, and headlights pierced the veil of rain-slicked windows to illuminate Mark's unmistakable luxury sedan pulling into the gravel drive, its tires crunching with the finality of an unwelcome verdict as he emerged in a trench coat that did little to conceal his disheveled state, his usually impeccable hair plastered flat and his posture radiating a mix of feigned paternal concern and underlying menace that set my pulse racing with a cocktail of fear and fury. He pounded on the door with insistence that echoed through the empty rooms, forcing me to confront him through the chain-locked screen amid the scent of ozone and my own simmering resolve, where he launched into a rehearsed monologue about how his private investigator had tailed my recent outings and uncovered whispers of inherited delusions from Eleanor's estate, demanding that I relinquish any fabrications she might have planted to sabotage his hard-earned stability, all while painting himself as the victim of my bitter post-divorce fantasies that threatened to upend the lives of our children who, he claimed with crocodile tears, depended on his success for their futures. Our exchange devolved into a tense standoff on the porch, rain mingling with the spray from his gesticulations as I parried his accusations with veiled references to the photo and ledgers without revealing specifics. Watching his composure fracture when I suggested that some partnerships from the past might unravel under scrutiny, his face paling to the shade of overripe bananas as he shifted tactics to threats of renewed custody battles over Emily and Jake's affections or liens against the farmhouse itself under probate disputes, a barrage that nearly buckled my knees, but instead ignited a steely retort about how his protections had always served his pockets first, culminating in my slamming the door after pressing a thermos of herbal tea laced with a mild laxative from the medicine cabinet into his hands as a parting gesture of goodwill that ensured his drive back to the city would be anything but smooth. Energized by the confrontation's adrenaline surge, yet haunted by the ethical tightrope it highlighted, my naive belief that personal barbs could substitute for systemic reckoning, a choice you might view as short-sighted indulgence in momentary catharsis rather than strategic patience, I channeled the residual spite into a more elaborate scheme the following afternoon. Leveraging online forums frequented by event planners and charity coordinators to anonymously orchestrate a donor mix-up for Mark's upcoming high-profile client dinner at the Cleveland Convention Center, where his firm was set to unveil a major philanthropy initiative aimed at burnishing their image amid recent scandals. By posing as a bumbling administrative assistant from a rival nonprofit, I rerouted his pledged contributions to causes directly opposing his clients' interests, such as environmental groups challenging industrial developments his real estate backers championed, ensuring that the evening's speeches awkwardly highlighted his generous support for policies that sowed discord among the assembled tycoons and media attendees. Reports filtered back through discreet social media scans and tips from a former acquaintance in the catering world by the next morning, detailing the gala's descent into chaos with heated whispers, premature exits by key investors, and Mark's humiliated attempts to salvage the narrative over dessert, his tie askew and laughter forced as the room buzzed with speculation about divided loyalties, prompting me to uncork a bottle of $2 wine from the pantry and toast alone to the stars. Emerging over the cornfields, savoring the witty irony of his empire teetering on a foundation of fabricated goodwill while chuckling at how such a petty pivot could amplify the cracks already forming from my earlier digital pranks. Yet as the evening waned and I sought solace in the safe's familiar confines, methodically cataloging the ledgers for potential escalation, my fingertips detected an unyielding resistance in the back panel that yielded under persistent pressure to reveal a narrow compartment I had overlooked, disgorging a small, dust-shrouded cassette tape labeled in Eleanor's precise script as the unspoken accord, its presence hinting at an audio testament that could vocalize the fraud's intricacies in her own unflinching words, but deploying it would necessitate broadcasting not just his misdeeds, but the intimate humiliations of our marriage, affairs, manipulations, and my own overlooked complicity in ignoring red flags to the public eye, demanding a level of exposure that blurred the line between avenger and spectacle. Holding that cassette tape in my palm as if it were a fragile relic from a bygone era, its plastic casing warm from the confines of the safe and etched with the faint scratches of time, I retreated to the farmhouse's quiet parlor where the grandfather clock ticked away the seconds like a metronome counting down to an irrevocable decision, spending the ensuing 48 hours in a haze of deliberation that blurred the boundaries between empowerment and self-sabotage, replaying Eleanor's handwritten warnings in my mind while the weight of potential fallout pressed upon me with the inevitability of an approaching Midwest winter storm, knowing that inserting this into a player would unlock not merely Mark's meticulously constructed facade, but also the intimate undercurrents of our fractured union, from the overlooked infidelities during his late-night client meetings to the financial deceptions that eroded our family nest egg year by year, all of which would spill into the public domain if I chose to amplify her voice through the channels of modern whistleblowing. The ambiguity of it all tormented me during sleepless nights on the lumpy sofa, where I wrestled with visions of a reclaimed future, perhaps selling the farmhouse at a profit bolstered by restitution claims and relocating to a sunlit apartment in Florida's Gulf Coast, surrounded by retirees sharing stories of reinvention over morning coffee, against the stark reality that unleashing this would cast me as the central figure in a media circus, my face splashed across local news segments and national podcasts dissecting the divorced nurse's vendetta against her tycoon ex, a narrative that could alienate Emily and Jake further by forcing them to choose sides publicly or, worse, invite countersuits from Mark's allies painting me as the unstable instigator driven by spite rather than justice, a path you might condemn as recklessly impulsive for a woman in her late 40s who should prioritize quiet healing over explosive confrontation. Yet in the quiet hours when doubt clawed deepest, the memory of his courtroom smirk and the sting of empty bank statements propelled me forward, affirming that true liberation demanded confronting the monster I had helped create through years of willful blindness to his charm's darker underbelly. Bolstered by this uneasy resolve, I ventured out under the cover of a drizzly dawn to the county archives in nearby Worcester, masquerading as a genealogy enthusiast researching family land grants to access microfiche records that corroborated the tape's impending revelations, my heart pounding as the archivist's indifferent gaze swept over me while I cross-referenced dates from the ledger against public filings, uncovering irrefutable links between Eleanor's partnerships and Mark's firm, including diverted escrow funds from the Hayes-Thompson Commons project that had seeded his first major merger in the early 2000s, a discovery that crystallized the Trump card's potency as a linchpin capable of unraveling not just his career, but the entire network of enablers who profited from such systemic slights against women like Mom who dared to build empires from scratch. Returning to the farmhouse with a folder of photocopied deeds clutched under my arm, I finally slotted the cassette into an antiquated player unearthed from the attic, the mechanism whirring to life with a hiss that gave way to Eleanor's steady voice, clear and unyielding as she recounted in detail a clandestine meeting from 1987 where Mark, then a junior associate hungry for validation, admitted on tape to engineering the undervaluation of her parcels to facilitate a kickback scheme with developers, his words laced with casual arrogance about how family ties make the best leverage, interspersed with her probing questions that exposed the fraud's mechanics, from falsified appraisals to offshore accounts that mirrored the very tactics his lawyers deployed against me decades later, her narrative concluding with a poignant directive to me: use this to reclaim what's yours, Sarah. But remember, the real victory lies in walking away unbroken, not in the ruins you leave behind. Transfixed by this auditory ghost, tears streaming as her cadence evoked the kitchen table confidences of my youth, I harnessed the surge of vindication to orchestrate the culmination of my revenge with a precision that blended Mom's shrewd foresight and my own digital savvy. Beginning by digitizing the tape's contents through a secure app on my laptop and uploading anonymized excerpts to a reputable whistleblower platform monitored by investigative journalists, timing the release to coincide with Mark's scheduled press conference announcing a blockbuster acquisition that would cement his status among Cleveland's elite, while simultaneously forwarding contextual documents to a network of advocacy groups focused on financial equity for women. Ensuring the story, framed not as personal grudge, but as a broader exposé on predatory practices in real estate law. To infuse the rollout with a touch of wry humor that undercut his self-importance, I seeded secondary leaks through pseudonymous posts on legal forums, detailing his golf cart fiasco and gala gaffes as cautionary tales from the files, which amplified the core allegations by portraying him as a bumbling emperor with no clothes. The viral threads gaining traction among former clients and industry insiders who piled on with their own grievances, transforming what could have been a dry scandal into a spectacle of schadenfreude that trended locally within hours. By midday, as I monitored the unfolding pandemonium from the porch swing with a thermos of strong coffee in hand, news alerts flooded my phone. The conference derailed mid-sentence by reporters' pointed queries, partners issuing terse statements about internal reviews, and federal regulators launching preliminary probes that promised to freeze assets and subpoena records, Mark's empire fracturing audibly through live feeds showing his ashen retreat from the podium, his tie crooked and eyes darting like a cornered animal, while whispers of class action suits from affected families echoed the very injustices Mom had fought, providing a profound satisfaction in witnessing the tables turn so poetically that I raised my mug in a silent salute to her ingenuity, chuckling at the irony of his downfall seated by the very partnership he once exploited. Yet, as the initial euphoria ebbed into the evening's quiet, with offers from attorneys representing potential claimants arriving via encrypted email and the farmhouse phone ringing off the hook from reporters I'd have to ignore, a profound ambiguity settled over me like the gathering dusk, prompting reflections on whether this trump card had truly emancipated me from the cycles of betrayal and loss, or merely reshuffled the deck, inviting new adversaries in the form of opportunistic lawyers chasing contingency fees or estranged children demanding explanations for the family secrets unearthed, leaving me to ponder in the safe's now empty glow if the revenge's sweet taste masked a lingering bitterness, the kind that questions whether freedom comes at the price of perpetual vigilance or if, in the end, Mom's ultimate lesson was to embrace the uncertainty as the price of authenticity in a world still stacked against women like us.